The transport shuttle broke atmosphere with a violent shake, its hull groaning against the volatile winds of Viron 6. The desert world stretched endlessly below, a sea of ochre dunes shimmering under the glare of 3 relentless suns. Clouds didn't exist here. The sky was the color of bleached metal, pulsing with heat, with only the occasional sand cyclone twisting far in the distance, like a rising serpent. Inside the shuttle's main bay, 12 cadets stood in silent formation, each representing a different world, a different species, a different evolutionary approach to survival. Among them stood one human, Darren Cole. He was average in appearance compared to the kaleidoscope of alien life around him. No shimmering scales like the Salkari, no psychic nodes like the pale-skinned Iridari, no prehensile limbs or biosuits grown from organic alloys. Just a lean frame, a tanned face, sun-scorched hair, and simple desert gear adapted from Earth's military archives. His gear was minimalist, sand-colored fabric, a neck wrap, and a waist pouch that held a scanner, thermal blade, and emergency foil sheet. He looked primitive. Even the instructor had hesitated briefly before handing him the deployment order, as if questioning whether this soft-skinned creature would last a single day. 72 hours, the voice over the intercom boomed. No assistance, no communication. Your success depends on adaptation. Learn or fail. The floor hatch split open with a hydraulic hiss. One by one, the cadets were dropped across designated zones. No group formations, no alliances. Survival was to be individual. Darren's harness pulled him forward. A violent rush of wind slammed into him as he descended by gravity chute, spiraling toward the cracked surface below. As he landed hard into a mound of burnt sand, the first blast of heat knocked the breath out of him. It wasn't just hot, it was alive. Heat that pressed into his lungs, clawed at his skin, and stabbed into his eyes with invisible daggers. He rolled to his feet and immediately pulled the scarf across his face. The surface temperature, according to his wrist scanner, read 68.2 deg's and climbing. The scanner's humidity reading barely flickered, less than 5%. He squinted at the horizon, already wavering with illusion-like distortions. Somewhere out there were the others, already dispersing to chase shade or dig for groundwater. Darren didn't move right away. He dropped to one knee and let the sand slip through his fingers. It was dry, coarse, but held tiny flakes of something dark, possibly decomposed organic matter. That meant something had once grown here. That was good. He moved slowly, choosing direction not by any tactical vision, but by a feeling he had developed back on Earth during survival exercises in the Mojave. Never rush in unfamiliar terrain. The terrain here was deceptive. What appeared to be a flat dune could easily conceal steep drops, scorched glass beds, or shifting pits. After walking nearly a kilometer, he found what he needed, a jagged outcrop of black rock protruding from the sand, casting a modest shadow. It wasn't much, but it would cut down direct sunlight during the mid-phase when all 3 suns aligned overhead and temperature peaked. He used a piece of the foil sheet to reflect heat away from the stone, then set up a shallow lean-to using local brush which looked brittle but had fibrous strands strong enough to bind. He sliced through a few stalks with his thermal blade and examined the inside. Dry, but with a faint tang of bitterness. Possibly toxic. Not for eating, but maybe useful for something else. He began constructing a pit just 20 centimeters deep with a wide base. He lined the bottom with a piece of plastic sheeting peeled from his emergency wrap, placed a small tin cup at the center and scattered the crushed brush around it. He then draped the foil across the pit, securing it with rocks on all sides. In the center, he placed a tiny pebble directly above the cup, causing the sheet to dip. It was crude, barely better than something a stranded scout might rig, but it was a solar still. The heat would force moisture from the organic matter, condensing on the underside of the foil and then dripping into the cup. It wouldn't give much, maybe 10 milliliters every few hours, but it was better than nothing. From the cliffs above, an unseen drone tracked his every move. It had been programmed to monitor the cadets, but its AI systems flagged Darren's behavior with a subtle anomaly marker. No other cadet had done anything resembling primitive construction. Most had activated their scanners and begun searching for hydration markers underground or looked for ancient aquifers or lifeform trails. But none had stopped to build. None had paused to prepare. Across the ridge, the Salkari cadet named Vor dug deep into the sand. using claws and seismic readings to locate subterranean frost veins. But the deeper he dug, the hotter it got. The ice never came. His body, covered in heat-dispersing scales, started to hiss as the outer layers began to cook under the triple sun. The iridari female, Solian, had collapsed into a meditative trance, hoping to preserve energy while her internal glands recycled fluids. A Thuranian, used to the cool wetlands of his ocean world, had begun to hallucinate by midday. Meanwhile, Darren adjusted a second still he had started from leftover materials. He worked silently, lips cracked, breathing shallow but with a practiced focus. He didn't pace. He didn't panic. He measured the angles of the foil, watched the sun's movement, and adjusted the tilt by less than a degree when needed. Every movement was deliberate. When the first droplets began to form and slide toward the pebble's center, he didn't smile. He simply waited. He knew not to rush. Night never came on Varan 6. There was only less bright and even brighter. But during one brief phase, the smallest sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows and dropping surface temperatures by a mere 5 degrees. Varan took that window to rest. He lay against the warm stone and stared into the sky. No stars here, just the haze of endless light and heat. He thought of Earth, of camping trips as a boy, of condensation on metal cups in the early morning. He whispered under his breath, "Old tricks still work." Then he closed his eyes, not to sleep, but to conserve breath, to stay still, to last. Above him, the drone tagged his camp with a new marker, survival technique, human, primitive, efficiency, unknown. Recommend observation. 71 hours remained. By the time Varan 6's second sun reached its zenith, the sand had begun to hiss. Heat waves shimmered across the open terrain, blurring the line between solid and air. The planet's brutal rhythm of burning silence resumed its relentless pattern. The third sun, smaller but more focused, crept higher, bathing the cracked landscape in a white-hot glow that pierced every surface. The air was no longer breathable in full gulps. Each breath felt like inhaling fire. Darren kept his movements measured. He remained beneath the slanted shelter he had constructed, the foil above him shimmering with trapped heat that it redirected outward. The stillhead started to produce visible drops now, tiny glimmers of water forming under the curved foil, funneling toward the pebble. In the cup, maybe 15 milliliters of clear liquid had collected. He didn't drink it yet. He waited. To the east, a low-frequency hum vibrated through the sand. It came from the Salkari cadet's locator beacon, barely audible but increasing in intensity as his vitals dipped. The drone watching from above had begun circling lower. Darren turned his head and narrowed his eyes at the flickering signal rising into the haze. He didn't stand up. He knew the rules. If the beacon flared bright yellow, it meant medical extraction was imminent. If it turned red, the cadet had lost consciousness. A sharp screech echoed across the dunes as the Salkari Vor attempted to crawl out of his dig site. His armor-plated skin, usually gleaming bronze, had dulled and cracked. The desert had overpowered his thermal glands. Steam rose off his back as he dragged himself toward the shadow of a rock spire. He didn't make it far. The red pulse began flashing on his beacon, and within seconds the retrieval drone descended. Varan 6's challenge had claimed its first. Darren blinked slowly, returning his gaze to his still. He tapped the cup with the tip of his blade, careful not to disturb the setup, then lifted it to his lips and took a slow, measured sip. The water was warm and slightly bitter, but safe. He took another sip, then set it down and sealed the foil again. With a second piece of plastic, he began preparing another collection point. The desert wouldn't offer much, but it would offer enough, if coaxed properly. To the south, a deep rumbling came from beneath the sand. The Thyranian cadet, large and gelatinous, had tried to burrow underground. His species thrived in humid caverns and cold oceans, and exposure to dry air was catastrophic to his biology. His limbs flailed in frustration, and his translucent skin had begun to flake. Darren watched him struggle, noting how the cadet tried to create a cavity to trap moisture. When he traveled the back roads, Darren watched him struggle, noting how the cadet tried to create a cavity to trap moisture. It wouldn't work. There was nothing down there but more hot sand. After several minutes, the Thuranian curled into a slow-motion collapse, his hydration shell visibly shrinking. His beacon flared. Another drone detached from the atmosphere and shot downward, retrieving him in a smooth arc of precision and silence. Darren didn't react. He checked the position of the suns again. The third one was directly overhead. This was the worst phase. The next 4 hours would be the most punishing of the entire cycle. If he could remain still and retain his water levels, he would have a better chance of making it through the night phase, when the temperature dipped just slightly and the air grew heavier with trace humidity. He adjusted his wrap around his mouth, tightening it to reduce moisture loss. Then he rested his back against the rock, letting its heat sink into his spine. His body was tired, but not yet desperate. He could still feel his heartbeat clearly, unpanicked. His scanner pulsed once with a soft tone, an alert. He pulled it close. It showed the nearby presence of the Iridari cadet, Solian. She approached slowly from the north, her white robes dragging in the sand, her skin shimmering with opalescent patterns that pulsed in slow, erratic waves. Her eyes were half-lidded, her lips dry and cracked, and her breathing labored. Darren didn't speak. She didn't either. She stopped about 10 meters away, swayed slightly, then dropped to her knees. He watched her for several minutes. She reached into her pack and pulled out a crystal node, pressed it to her temple, and closed her eyes. Her species often relied on meditation to slow their bodily functions. Perhaps she thought she could wait out the suns. But Darren knew the heat here didn't forgive spiritual hope. It devoured anything still and exposed. Another hour passed. The Iridari hadn't moved. Darren continued to collect water. The second still began to condense droplets more quickly, its positioning slightly better than the first. He leaned in and tasted the new batch, slightly sweeter, possibly more vapor in the plant fibers. Encouraged, he reinforced the base with tighter seals. His fingers ached, but the movements kept his mind sharp. Across the valley, a shimmering shape emerged, one of the insectoid cadets, legs twitching under the heat. He carried a heat sensor module, trying to locate buried water pockets. But his movements were erratic. His wings fluttered nervously, and his exoskeleton had started to fracture. Darren recognized the signs of systemic heat fatigue. The insectoid stopped, fell forward, and rolled to the side. Another beacon lit the sky. Darren exhaled through his teeth. 4 down, 8 left. His scanner pinged again, this time not for vitals, but for atmospheric change. He stared at the numbers. A slight shift in air pressure. Humidity had risen. Barely, but enough. He stood for the first time in hours and walked to the top of the rock outcrop. He scanned the area. Far in the distance, a dust devil spun like a dying starfish. That wasn't what caused the change. He turned eastward. A low, rolling hill shimmered differently. Not heat, moisture. Not enough to be a spring, but something was evaporating nearby, maybe remnants of a recent storm or a patch of moss deep in the crevices. It would take energy to reach it, risky, but he marked the coordinates anyway. If things worsened, he'd go. He returned to his camp and reinforced the shelters. The Iridari cadet was still meditating, her presence barely detectable. She hadn't asked for help, hadn't moved toward him, and he hadn't offered assistance. The test was solo. Survival wasn't about kindness here. It was about discipline. Still, he placed one of his stills facing her direction, angled to catch any trace moisture from her slow exhalations, a gamble. But maybe her breathing would feed the process. The third sun finally dipped low enough to reduce direct exposure. Darren sat again and drank carefully. He leaned his head back, eyelids heavy, heart still steady. The worst hours had claimed more cadets than expected. He had barely spoken a word all day. He hadn't needed to. Above, the drone marked his vitals. Stable. Hydration level, 52%. Pulse, 73 BPM. Status, exceptional. The AI observed his secondary water collection strategy and labeled it human improvisation, variable source siphoning. Night would not bring rest, but it would bring a chance to recover. Darren closed his eyes and whispered the count to himself. 60 hours left. The sky over Viren 6 had changed, though not in any way that would comfort the cadets who still remained conscious. There were no clouds, no storms, no shade, but the color of the air had shifted ever so slightly, from silver, white, to something with a faint green hue. It wasn't a sign of mercy from the planet. It was a warning. The second day had begun, and with it came the height of psychological strain. By now, those who had energy left weren't thinking clearly. Minds that had evolved for cold logic, precise telepathy, or mechanical thought were beginning to unravel under the weight of thirst, heat, and silence. Darren awoke with a dry throat and sand clinging to the edges of his eyes. His rest had been light, more a controlled trance than sleep. He knew better than to let his body go limp for too long. Muscles stiffened fast in dry heat, and hallucinations crept in without warning. He sat up, slowly, and checked his solar stills. Both cups had gathered more than he had hoped. Combined, he had nearly 60 milliliters of water. Barely enough to keep him stable, but enough to start another cycle. He drank slowly, mouthfuls timed with his breathing. He let the water linger in his mouth before swallowing, absorbing as much as possible through his cheeks. It wasn't satisfying. Nothing about this was. But it kept him lucid. That was enough. From his elevated position near the rock, Darren could see the Iridari cadet Solian still kneeling in place. Her crystalline skin no longer pulsed with light. Her node had dimmed. He wasn't sure if she was alive or merely meditating through the collapse. Her beacon had not activated. He said nothing and turned away. This wasn't a rescue mission. In the distance, someone screamed. The sound cracked through the desert like shattering glass, dissonant and high-pitched. Darren stood and scanned the horizon. The scream had come from the west. Through the heat distortion, he spotted movement. Erratic, fast, and wrong. One of the avian cadets, a young male from the Firenel species, was stumbling across the sand, arms flailing. His wings, once majestic and wide, had become limp and darkened by burn damage. He moved like a man chased by invisible wolves. Darren could already tell what was happening. Delirium. The Firenel collapsed to his knees, then leapt up again, running in uneven arcs, screaming words in a language Darren couldn't understand. His body jerked violently as if fighting something only he could see. Darren recognized the signs. The mind was fracturing. Heat stroke, dehydration, panic, deadly when combined. The cadet finally crashed into the side of a dune and didn't rise. His beacon remained dark. Darren narrowed his eyes. That meant the system hadn't detected a life-threatening status yet. It would soon. He returned to his stills and began constructing a third from spare materials he had scavenged. Shards of foil, compressed brush fibers, and the reflective inner layer of his ration pouch. It wouldn't be as efficient, but it would double his yield if he placed it near the base of the rock, where condensation was more likely to form during the brief humidity spike that arrived at sunset. He dug carefully, hands wrapped in cloth to avoid burns from the scalding sand. His wrist scanner pulsed softly. Another drop in ambient humidity. Atmospheric moisture had fallen below 3%. The desert was tightening its grip. Movement to the north drew his attention. A thick, four-legged cadet, one of the mechanoid hybrids from the Varn Dominion, had begun crawling across the flats, dragging a broken leg assembly behind him. Sparks shot from the exposed joint. Darren recognized the desperation in his eyes. He wasn't crawling toward safety. He was crawling toward Darren. The Varnian stopped 20 meters away and shouted hoarsely in galactic common. "Water, share it. Protocol 7, resource mutual aid." Darren didn't move. "This is an individual survival exercise," he replied calmly. "You know the rules." "Override," the cadet rasped. "Directive 14 permits cooperation in extreme—" "You're not my team," Darren said. "No override applies." The Varnian glared, then tried to crawl closer. Darren stood and lifted his thermal blade, not in threat but in warning. The message was clear. The Varnian stopped, muttered something Darren couldn't hear, and collapsed. No beacon lit. Darren turned his back. He didn't feel proud. He didn't feel cruel. He felt focused. This wasn't about heroics. This was a lesson in how far instinct could take someone when everything else failed. He worked in silence, his mind slipping into rhythms. Dig, bind, cover, seal. He checked the angle of the third still and sat back. His heartbeat was steady. His thoughts were sharp. His thirst was manageable. He had started to feel something new now. Not satisfaction, but momentum. The planet was testing him, and for the first time he felt that he was testing it back. Hours passed. Another cadet was extracted, a female from the Carthari cluster, her skin boiling beneath her armor as she tried to hide beneath her own body plates. Her scream had been different, quiet, like a breath lost to the wind. Darren didn't flinch when the retrieval drone came. He simply turned over his foil and wiped condensation into his water cup. He noticed something strange then. One of the drones wasn't leaving. It hovered above his camp, quiet, unmoving, almost watching. He waved at it, but it didn't respond. Its lens pulsed once, then again. He frowned. Was it analyzing him? Recording his technique? He looked back at his camp. The shelters were simple, the stills rudimentary, but they worked. Perhaps that was the point. He turned his back to the drone and went about his maintenance. He refused to perform for a machine. By the second sun's descent, the temperature dropped by a single degree. His scanner still read danger zone levels, but the difference was noticeable to his lungs. The heat didn't cut quite as deep now. He took the opportunity to stretch his legs, walking in small loops to keep his blood flowing. He kept his water inside him and his emotions locked tight. On the horizon, a shimmer flickered. For a brief moment, he thought he saw a structure. Tall, metallic, ancient. It seemed to rise and fade in a second. A mirage. He knew better than to trust his eyes now. The heat played tricks. Illusions appeared like ghosts. Waterfalls, oases, towers. All lies. He sat again and closed his eyes, pressing his fingertips against his temples to ground himself. His body was starting to feel the strain now. His joints ached, his breathing grew shallower with each hour, and his neck burned where the scarf had slipped. But he had survived the worst of the second day. The others hadn't. He glanced toward Solian. She hadn't moved in over 12 hours. Her head was bowed, and her arms rested at her sides. He couldn't tell if she was alive. He didn't dare check. That wasn't part of the test. Darren drank the last of the second cup and stared at the twin shadows stretching across the sand. Night would never truly come, but the brightness would ease soon. If he could last through one more phase, he could reach the third day. He whispered to the wind, 48 hours left. Then he lay down, back to the rock, still breathing, still calculating, still human. The air carried a bitter sharpness now, a texture that didn't belong to wind or heat but to something older, like static built over silence. Varan 6 had begun to whisper its true nature, not in storms or roaring beasts, but in exhaustion. Nothing moved without cost. Even the sand had gone quiet, no longer swirling or shifting as it had during the first hours. It lay heavy and still, the kind of stillness that suggested the planet was listening. Darren opened his eyes at the same moment the second sun began to rise again. His pulse had slowed through the long watch of semi-darkness, but it hadn't dropped dangerously. He could still count it, still feel the quiet drumming behind his ribs. The rock beside him had cooled just enough to be tolerable against his back, but the relief wouldn't last. Already the edge of the foil glinted faintly, catching the new heat like a blade catching moonlight. The time for rest had ended. He stood carefully, letting his weight settle evenly before walking. His legs felt stiff but not weak. The water he had stored had kept him functional. His third still had produced little during the night, less than expected. But the first two had offered just enough to make a second sunrise survivable. He crouched, drank half a cup's worth, and stowed the rest. His lips were cracked. His skin had begun to peel beneath the scarf. The iridary cadet was gone. Her shape no longer rested near the rocks. Only a shallow depression in the sand remained, as if she had dissolved back into the planet. Darren's first thought was that she had died and been extracted quietly, but no drone had come during the night. He would have heard it. He scanned the terrain. There were no footprints, no drag marks, no thermal trail. It was as though she had chosen to disappear into the earth, or perhaps hallucination had finally claimed his perception. He didn't dwell. He turned to his shelter and began reinforcing it. He layered additional sand along the base to trap the coolness that still lingered. Each motion was deliberate. Efficiency had become instinct. He sharpened the angle of the foil on his primary still, calculating the sun's trajectory by memory. He no longer checked his scanner for angles. He knew the arc of Varan 6 light by heart now. An unexpected hum drew his attention skyward. A larger drone than any he had seen before floated above the valley, sleek, black, and silent. Its body was segmented, and its lenses moved in slow mechanical rotations. Unlike the retrieval drones, this one bore no markings. It hovered far higher, but its focus was clear. It wasn't scanning the terrain, it was watching him. He straightened and faced it. "You going to help?" he muttered. No answer, of course. The drone shifted slightly to the left, as though aligning itself with the horizon. Then, it simply remained there. He ignored it. Not far away, another cadet stumbled into view. This one moved like his bones were filled with sand. His head drooped, limbs loose and dragging. He wore armor that belonged to the Zoeth Empire, glimmering plates of reflective glass fused to sinew. But now the armor was dull, cracked, and hanging unevenly. His breath came in ragged gasps, each one leaving a smear of heat on the air. The cadet collapsed 10 meters from Darren's camp, face buried in the ground. No beacon lit. Darren approached, cautiously. He rolled the body slightly with the toe of his boot. The cadet's eyes were open, unfocused. A line of dust had caked into the corners of his lips. He was still alive. Barely. Darren knelt beside him and checked the man's wrist. Pulse was faint. He hesitated. He could walk away. He had enough water to last through the peak heat of this day. But something gnawed at the edge of his mind. Something different this time. Not compassion, not obligation, curiosity. He uncapped the second cup and tipped a few drops into the cadet's mouth. The reaction was instant. The man gagged, coughed, and clutched at Darren's wrist. Darren pulled away before the grip could tighten, stepped back, and watched. The cadet rolled onto his side, eyes blinking rapidly. "Why," the man croaked. "You were already too close," Darren answered. "If you were going to die, I didn't want your body stinking up the camp." The cadet managed something between a laugh and a groan. "Fair." Darren returned to his seat, scanning the sky again. The larger drone was still there, still unmoving. A voice crackled suddenly across his earpiece, one that hadn't spoken since drop day. "Cadet Cole, please confirm your status." He stiffened. The earpiece had been dead for days, intentionally muted as part of the test. No contact was allowed. "This line isn't authorized," he replied. "We are overriding for protocol evaluation," the voice continued. It was mechanical, genderless. "You are demonstrating behavioral deviation from expected human responses." Darren looked at the drone. "What does that mean?" "You are not demonstrating distress. I'm surviving. Your hydration retention is above projection. Your pulse stability is abnormal. Explain." "I prepared. I adapted. That's what this test is for." Silence followed. Then the voice returned. Quieter. "Do you require extraction?" He snorted. "No." The line went dead. He looked at the man recovering in the sand. The cadet was now upright, leaning against a small boulder. His armor was steaming. "You talk to the drones too?" the man rasped. "Not usually," Darren said. "Just when they forget what they're testing." By noon, the sun had erased every shadow. The heat was blinding. The two men sat in silence, not speaking. Darren rationed water again, calculating what he would need to reach the final phase. He would have to move one still to a new position, south-facing, toward the ridge that retained heat longer. It would reduce efficiency for now, but pay off later when condensation increased in the cooler hours. The man from the Zoeth Empire tried to stand and failed. Darren didn't help. He wasn't here to carry anyone. "You're different," the man said, an element. "You're just used to machines solving problems. Humans aren't supposed to last this long. Your species isn't optimized for heat." "Exactly," Darren replied. "That's why we learned how to cheat." The third sun finally began to fall again. Light softened, but only just. Darren rose, shifted the stills again, and packed sand around the base of the rock to preserve cool air overnight. His hands trembled. He didn't fight the shaking. He let his body feel it, absorb it, burn through it. Pain wasn't the enemy. Complacency was. The drone above him flashed once, its lens briefly pulsing a deep blue, then it vanished. Darren watched the sky where it had gone and whispered one word under his breath. "Good." The final morning came not with hope, but with weight. Every muscle in Darren's body felt denser than it had the night before, as if gravity had increased while he slept. His limbs refused to stretch properly at first. His back throbbed from days spent sleeping against rock and heat. Even his vision seemed slower to sharpen, as though his eyes were reluctant to accept the same sky again. But he had made it. He sat up, rubbed the corners of his mouth, and sipped the last few drops from the third cup. The taste had changed overnight, more mineral than before, probably residue from the bottom of the container. He didn't care. It was water. He drank every drop. The man from the Zoeth Empire hadn't stirred. He lay still against the boulder, mouth parted, chest barely moving. Darren checked his vitals with a light press to his throat. Still alive. Barely. Darren had nothing more to offer him and no obligation. The test had not been designed for two. If the man survived, he would do so on his own momentum. Darren stood and stared toward the ridge. The sun wasn't yet high, and the rock shelf offered the final chance to check the terrain before the heat surged. The planet had gone quiet again. No distant screams, no collapsing bodies, no shimmer of movement through the dunes. Those who hadn't dropped out were either unconscious or hiding in burrows dug from panic. He didn't care to find out how many remained. He climbed the ridge, step by heavy step, lungs tight. The stone beneath his boots was warm, but not scalding yet. He reached the top and scanned the valley. No figures moved. No beacons pulsed. No shadows shifted. Just endless sand, lifeless and mute. The silence was total. Then a sound cut through it. A long, sharp whistle. Mechanical, cold, and final. The test had ended. A fleet of drones appeared from the west, rising above the cliffs like an army of shadows. They weren't sleek like the Watchers. These were bulky, practical machines designed for retrieval. Their movements stirred the dust in symmetrical waves as they descended to extract those who could no longer stand. Darren turned away from the view and began his descent, his body aching with every movement. When the drone arrived for him, it didn't offer words. It hovered with clinical patience while he packed his kit. He folded the foil carefully, pocketed the scanner, and crushed the cups flat before tucking them into his side pouch. He took one last look at the stills, now dry and sagging under the weakening morning light. Then he stepped forward and let the machine lock its harness around his chest. As it lifted him into the sky, Darren didn't look back. The debriefing room aboard the orbital station was sterile and cold, lit by panels that cast no shadows. He stood alone at the center of the chamber, facing a semicircle of instructors and analysts, most of them non-human. A Salkari general, his scales polished to ceremonial sheen, adjusted a monitor. An Iridari commander with gemstone pupils reviewed neurodata on a glass screen. Beside her, a Zenthian observer tapped his mandibles in thought. "Cadet Cole," the Salkari said, his voice like metal dragged across stone. "You have exceeded expectations." Darren didn't respond. He kept his posture neutral, breathing evenly. He had nothing left to prove. The data had done the speaking. The Iridari leaned forward. "Explain the decision to share hydration with Cadet Velen of the Zoeth Empire. That was not a requirement." "He was dying," Darren said. "I had enough to spare. It wasn't charity, it was calculation." "Explain." "If he died beside my camp, his body would have drawn carrion, larvae, vultures. This wasn't a sterile lab. I removed the variable." The Zenthian nodded with what might have been approval. "You also spoke with Observer Drone 9. He initiated the contact. You were aware that communication was prohibited." "I didn't ask for it." The Salaki folded his claws together. "The hydration technique you employed has been catalogued as primitive Earth method, solar distillation. Your academic records do not include formal engineering background. Where did you learn it?" "My grandfather taught it to me on a fishing trip." Murmurs passed between the instructors, low and indecipherable. The Iradi spoke again. 7 cadets extracted, 3 deceased, 1 in critical stasis. Only 1 reached the 72-hour mark with no emergency flag. That was you." "I was aware of my limits," Darren said. "Most cadets attempted to innovate with high-logic engineering, failed and deteriorated. You defaulted to low-tech methods. Why?" "Because heat doesn't care about innovation." The Iridari blinked slowly. "Explain." "Advanced systems fail when you have no resources. Complex ideas demand time, tools, and energy. I didn't have any of those. I worked with what I had. The goal wasn't to impress. The goal was to live. The instructors exchanged glances. A long silence passed. Then the Salkari pressed a command. The room darkened. A hologram shimmered to life in the air above Darren. A projection of his camp, his shelters, his stills. Every movement he had made was recorded, tagged, categorized. Efficiency rates, heat mapping, hydration yield. He recognized moments, pauses where he had hesitated, turns of the head, slow decisions. The system had watched everything. Even his silence had been measured. Your data will be used to revise the Galactic Academy's Desert Survival Curriculum, the Salkari said. Effective immediately. Darren raised an eyebrow. What does that mean for me? You will be invited to serve as an instructional advisor. Your survival model will be adapted across 39 planetary simulations. I'm not a teacher, Darren said. No, you are not. Another silence passed. Dismissed, the Iridari said quietly. He left the chamber without bowing. No applause followed him, no parade waited outside. Just a cold corridor lined with steel walls and the echo of his boots. His body still ached, but his mind felt distant from the pain now. Something had shifted during those 3 days, not just inside him, but in the eyes of those who watched. He walked alone down the hallway toward the dormitory wing, passing cadets who looked up and then quickly looked away. He wasn't one of them anymore, not entirely. He wasn't the strongest or the smartest or the most genetically enhanced, but he had become something harder to measure. He stepped into the lift, pressed the level for quarters, and stared into his own reflection on the door. The man who looked back at him was burnt, chapped, and weathered, but upright, breathing, present. The doors closed, and for the first time in 3 days, Darren allowed himself to smile.